Students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is separation of powers. And here are your objectives. Please make sure that you have your vocab sheet with you and something to write with. Now, pause the video, look these objectives over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. In the last lesson, you looked at the first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. You might remember that the Articles of Confederation attempted to create a system of federalism, where power was shared by the state governments and the federal government. However, the federal government was too weak to keep the country unified, creating many problems. As a result, the Founding Fathers decided to get rid of the Articles of Confederation and create a new constitution to replace it. In 1787, delegates or representatives from each state met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to create that new constitution. This meeting was called the Constitutional Convention. The delegates were not a very good representation of the country's population. All of them were white men, and most of them were wealthy. There were no women, Native Americans, or African Americans in attendance. The Constitution that the delegates created at the Constitutional Convention is called the U.S. Constitution. It's also often called the supreme law of the land because it is the highest authority in the United States. In other words, nobody is allowed to violate the Constitution, and anything that the government does must agree with the rules that it sets out. If the government tries to do something that violates the rules of the Constitution, its actions are said to be unconstitutional, which means illegal. We will look more at this idea later. The U.S. Constitution that the framers created at the Constitutional Convention is the Constitution that our country's government is still based on today, and I find it impressive that it's lasted so long. One reason that it has been so effective and long-lasting is because it establishes a very important idea called separation of powers. Separation of powers means that the federal government is divided into 3 different groups or branches, and each branch has its own job to do. Because each branch can only do certain things, separation of powers prevents one branch, or even one person, from having too much power. Remember, the framers wanted a strong federal government, but they did not want to see it run by a powerful ruler like a king. So, by separating the government, they ensured that one person couldn't control all of it. I want to emphasize that when we talk about separation of powers, we are only referring to the federal government. Everything you learned in the last lesson about state governments, you can ignore. Today we are only focusing on the federal government. Now let's take a look at each of the 3 branches. The first branch is called the legislative branch, and its job is to make laws. We also call the legislative branch Congress, and we call the members of this branch congressmen and congresswomen. We also refer to the members of the legislative branch as lawmakers because their job is to make and pass laws. Congress consists of 2 different groups of lawmakers. One is called the Senate, and the other is called the House of Representatives. Lawmakers in the Senate are called senators, while the lawmakers in the House of Representatives are just called representatives. For now, don't worry about the differences between the Senate and the House of Representatives. We will come back to that later. For now, you should know that the legislative branch makes laws, is also called Congress, and consists of 2 groups of lawmakers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The second branch is called the executive branch, and its job is to enforce the laws. The executive branch consists of the president, the vice president, and a group of advisors to the president called the cabinet. The president gets to pick his or her cabinet, and cabinet members have titles that you might have heard of, like Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, and others. Let me go back to the job of the executive branch, to enforce laws. What does that mean exactly? The president is the head of the military, and if a state refuses to follow federal laws, the president can send in the military to force a state to follow them. In other words, the president is enforcing the laws, making sure that they're followed. This has happened a few times in history that the president has had to send in troops to enforce laws, and we'll look at some examples later on in the year. The last branch of the federal government is called the judicial branch, and its job is to interpret the laws. Interpret means that the judicial branch gets to decide when laws have been broken. The judicial branch consists of the Supreme Court and all the other federal courts. And the people on these courts who interpret the laws are called judges or justices. Now, if you finish copying, take a look at this image and summarize what you've just learned. Pause the video if you'd like. All right, that's all for today's lesson. I want you to review these objectives, take notes on loose leaf so that you have a reference for the do now, and if you don't know the answer to any or aren't sure, just rewind the video and review. Bye, students.